Hi guys, today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, Communication and Competence. We won't have a lot of supplemental reading, so you still have a chance to get used to the text and get used to an overview of what the course is going to be about. I'm going to try to keep this video brief and under 15 minutes. It's an attempt, we'll see. And with that, that means that I will not be going through each of these slides slowly. I'm asking again that you read the chapter before watching the slides, and then I will go through and talk about the high points, things that I think require a little bit more information, and then I will somewhere in this video talk about and allude you to your assignment for the day. You'll also get an email from me when that assignment's available, which should be shortly after this is posted. But again, this video will not talk about everything that you'll need to know or be responsible for knowing, but we'll try to touch on the more important points. Okay, so again, you want to watch this, you want to look at the slides and access the slides independently of this video. So today we're talking about communication and competence, as I mentioned, and so looking at our outline, we'll talk about what is communication and provide a definition that will be important for you, that will more likely than not be a test question. We'll talk about a model of communication competency and talk about how to be a competent communicator and all of the different things we have to consider to be a competent communicator. And then we'll talk about skill building and how to take a process perspective. Okay? So first is, what is communication? And I think this is a very important detail that must be repeated. If you're in the School of Communication, the Brian Lamb School of Communication, if your major has anything to do with communication, and I'm talking about the pattern of interaction between individuals and meaning, making meaning and regulating social interaction and social reality, which we will get to through our definition, you are not studying communications with an S. That's in terms of broadcasting and mass media. As an individual who studies interpersonal communication, it's a singular term, communication N, period, no S, okay? But I like to harbor that point because this field often gets misrepresented. So keep in mind that communication is often defined in a variety of different ways. As you see on your PowerPoint, since 1972, or rather in 1972, there were over 126 definitions, and it's been a long time since 1972, over 40 years. So several more have emerged since then. But what you need to know is the one provided here on our slide, the process whereby humans collectively create and regulate social reality. So you might think about what that might mean for you as we go along. And so again, the definition is here, and there are 5 points that you need to know about the definition. So the first is its process. So communication is dynamic, it's constantly changing. So your relationship with your friend may remain steady and strong over time, but in one instance you can change everything, right? So there's no guarantee that communication will be static. Static would be unchanging, and there's no promise that the way you communicate with someone today will not be the same as how you communicate with them tomorrow. Thinking about relationship development, when you first meet somebody and how do you interact with them when you're trying to get their attention, while you're flirting, versus how you act in a stable relationship, versus how you act when you're uncertain. Maybe you suspect something's going wrong, you suspect they want to leave, or you suspect that you want to leave. How does your communication change with that person? So keeping in mind that our process of communication is constantly changing, it's a very dynamic situation. It's also problematic to try to take communication out of context, right? So we see these quotes. It's very difficult to understand, to really embrace and accept the situation out of context, because you need to know all of the features that are going on to get a really good understanding of what the meaning was. The second is uniquely human. And there are texts and even communication scholars who are now studying books and articles about communication with animals. And that's all well and good. In this course, we're only interested in the interaction that occurs between 2 individuals. And largely, I can say minimally, the textbook features individuals of stable mentality. So we don't talk about people who might be in incompetent moments. They don't talk about people who are stressed out beyond belief, or people who might be drugged in some capacity or have some type of disability that inhibits their ability to communicate. This course is specifically talking about general patterns among able-bodied people in normal everyday interactions, right? So we can extrapolate that some of the things we're going to learn are going to be different in these different scenarios. Number three, it's a collective activity, which means that meaning making, communication has to happen um, with others, right? So intrapersonal communication, that communication in our head, is not what we're interested in here. I'm interested in what happens when I communicate with another and how we're sending feedback back and forth to each other. Are they confused? Are they agreeing with me? Are they disagreeing? Or am I rolling my eyes? And how do we create this and interpret what's going on? So it's a collective group, a small group as an interpersonal, minimally two people activity. It's a creative endeavor in that there's no that we create meaning as we go along. We add our own material, and that we are not. We can be abstract. We can be creative, and that we're not constrained by concrete vocabulary that may not have an abstract concept. And so. And then lastly, it's regulatory. It has influence and it has power. If you've ever lost your voice, and the book talks about this, if you've ever lost your voice and you cannot speak, you'll see the power of communication, right? And that when you don't have a voice, how small and frustrating it can be, and how you really feel you can be disheartened from this. Moving on to what is communication. So implications is that we create our own realities through communication. So the way we see the world may be completely different from somebody else, and how they see the world based on how they frame it, they think about it, and how they share their experience. We allow what we create through communication to control us. So one of the examples I like, I grew up in South Mississippi where being a lady and being ladylike was very important. And in reality, that's a concept that we made up. Right? We made up this idea of being ladylike or being masculine. We all subscribe to it. It's a social reality of expectations. But knowing that I'm supposed to be ladylike will dictate how I speak, whom I speak to, how I hold my body. The fact that I'm keep my legs together where men might have the ability to sit with their knees further apart, but keeping the ankles crossed. These are all concepts that we created, these expectations and behaviors that we follow that we created. Communication takes place in a cultural context, in that we change our communication, how our communication is interpreted and what it means, all matters on where we are, right? If any of you've traveled before, you know that rules of behavior that exist in one place do not exist in another place. What's considered acceptable in some areas, what you can talk about, how you're supposed to respond, how you enact particular things differ based on where you are. I think of just yesterday I was at Purdue's graduation ceremony, and how graduation was organized and orchestrated differed in the Elliott Hall of Music than it did in the University of Southern Mississippi or Rutgers, where I graduated in a gymnasium. And so the behaviors that people had at my graduation ceremonies varied very differently from how I saw graduation yesterday, because the cultural context dictated what was appropriate, and people subscribed to that and followed that. And then what is important in interpersonal communication, which I have as IC here, but you'll also see as IPC, is that which is done when people are together. So again, it's a collective activity. Okay? Let's see if there's anything else down here. Moving on, we have something that I want you to think about are what are some words or concepts that control people's lives. So I'll likely post on Twitter what are some other concepts like ladylike that dictate our behavior. I'm just going to jot that down. And words that constrain us or that might be culturally variable, right? And so you'll have the opportunity to come up with that. And obviously, it's a participation point, so please do so. Moving on, we're going to talk about a model of communication competence, and there's 5 competencies. And so the first is communication competence, the ability to communicate in an effective and appropriate manner. So please look into what it means to do things correctly, as well as what it means to do things properly. And the different abilities of a competent communicator. So assigning meanings to the world, seeing things and knowing what you're seeing, being able to interpret it, right? So you and I might see the same communicative event. Was that an insult? Was that a compliment? Should I be offended, right? And a competent communicator should be able to do that. To set goals strategically, so think about how you would approach your professor if you think there was a grade, an error in your grade. So you might think about it, you might plan it, and that would be your being strategic. How to take on social roles appropriately, and we'll talk more about that as the semester continues, but that we might play many roles. We might play the role of an employee, a student, a partner, a son, a daughter, a cousin, and that role could, and largely probably would, influence how we enact a particular behavior, how we ask for things, demand things. It sets the tone. How to present a valued image of yourself, and we'll talk about that in terms of self-concept and personality, but that it's important to know how to present ourselves in given situations. How do we know how to dress? That we know that if we're going to a sporting event, the image that we want to portray might be largely different in this context than that context, right? And then generate intelligible messages. So how do I communicate? What language do I use? What vocabulary do I use? How quickly do I speak? Do I smile? Do I not smile? Do I handshake now? Do I wait for them to look at me? Right? These are, I like to use examples from like mafia movies that I'm into, and you can see that there are, and I'll bring in examples when relevant, but you can see that people tailor their communication, and what would be considered an intelligible message in potentially a mafia movie might be different than, like, that's how, to show you're part of the mafia environment, you have to form your message in one way, then how it might be different if you were than you were outside of that environment. There's also some readings we'll look at in chapter 13 about this trucker scenario and how they use words, and also within our Teamsterville article through chapter 4, which would be Phillips in 1975, that shows us how language and language choice differs by the culture and the community that you're communicating in. And so you can examine these ways to be a competent communicator through these 5 types of process competence: message competence, interpretive competence, role competence, self-competence, and goal competence, as you see on the slide. And so moving to the first one, message competency, the ability to make message choices that others can comprehend and attend to. So can you make verbal and nonverbal messages, and can you do them appropriately by content and relational? So do you make the right message? Is your word choice appropriate? And did you make the right message per the relationship you're in? So I'm going to move on, but please review these slides more carefully. Interpretive, so can you see what's happening? Can you watch an event and know, oh, I must be watching a wedding based on these things that I'm seeing. I must be watching a sporting event. Is that a fight? Is she crying? Those are the types of questions you ask when you're trying to size up people with the interpretive competence. Moving on to the third here is role competence. Am I playing my role properly in this culture, in this situation? And culture is a term that could mean geographic location, like I'm in Japan. Am I behaving appropriately for a woman who's in Japan? Or it could be culture as woman versus man. It could be a culture as in student, the student culture at Purdue. And how do I know how to act appropriately per that role in that culture? But role also can mean a variety of other things, and we'll discuss roles at greater depth later. Point 4 is self-competence. Do you know how to present a desired self-image? And I think about myspace.com, which might be before you, but how in MySpace we had a lot of choice in how we put our profile pages together, and the images that we picked, and the music that was playing. And that's similar to some ideas of Facebook and what we allow to be visible as well. Or your Twitter account, which you'll learn I'm getting very new to Twitter, but some of you have very detailed background pages, which I think are fantastic. And then some of you, like me, have a very boring page. I think that's also fine. Some of you have quotes under your name. Some of you don't, like me. And that's all fine. But how do you choose to display yourself in public? Competency number 5. So do you know how to set goals? And so in our Phillipson article, the Phillipson, How to Speak Like a Man in Teamsterville, we learn that when individuals, and this is all about men, when men want to appeal to their superiors, they'll often take a friend with them to speak on their behalf, or they'll speak to their parish priest who will speak on their behalf. And that's a strategic and appropriate way to communicate. So speaking directly to your superiors would not be, right? And so goal competence, knowing how to craft your message, making appropriate choices. Moving on to culture and context, learning a little bit about what culture is and how culture changes by history, how technology changes culture, right? And so our book talks a little bit about how space has changed in terms of definition because meeting up with others or contacting people has largely changed because we can instantaneously get a hold of people in ways that we never could before. Relational culture affects how you communicate. So who am I in this group? Am I a sibling? Am I a girlfriend or boyfriend or partner? Will affect how I communicate. So and so culture is not necessarily people from Buenos Aires acting differently than people from, say, Beijing, but culture can take on a variety of different terms and different meanings. So please check out that section more in depth in the textbook. Also of interest is, why do we fail at communication even when we know what to do? So we might plan and we might prepare, and so imagine you're going on a job interview. You know what to say, you know how to act, you've been practicing. You're doing a public speech even. What causes you to fail, to not do as well, even though you know what to do? And so we've got fatigue, or anxiety, contradictory attitudes, beliefs, poor motivation, being stubborn, and lack of practice. And so I ask you to check out the book, but a second Twitter is going to be about what happens when we fail at communication. And you might find that we have 3 activities just tomorrow. And what are some other ways or some examples of when you might have failed at communication? Okay, and so I'll send out that tweet tomorrow. Share with us moments when you might have failed at communication, even though you were cognizant of what you were supposed to do. Skill building, taking on perspective. And so it talks about how we need to monitor our own beliefs, as well as not only to focus on the content of what we're trying to say, but the form, right? And so when you practice your speeches, you know that you have to get the material across, but you have to get it out in a particular way. And so, focus some on that. And then there'll be one more point that I'll post tomorrow on Twitter, and that's going to ask us to look at page 15 in our textbook about insulting the meat. And this takes us back to our topic on culture that talks about interpersonal ritual, and asks us to think about ways we communicate that say something about our cultural values. Now, you've gotten to the end of this video, we're at 17 minutes in, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to change what I just projected. There's going to be 2 opportunities tomorrow for you to respond on Twitter. 2. One is briefly talk about a time when you were fully aware of how you needed to communicate, but barriers that kept you from communicating properly, right? And so you'll have a little tweet about that. So that'll be one, barriers. And then the other is going to be a merge of what I said before about communication variables that have cultural meanings that we've created, and it's going to be a combination between that, what are some words that might constrain our behavior, like being ladylike, as well as ways that we communicate that say something about our cultural values. And so you'll be asked to read this synopsis on page, I don't know if you can see it, I'll get used to this. Page 15 has a little box about insulting the meat, and asks us, it talks about how when these hunters go out and find and kill their prey, when they come back to their culture, strict norms govern the way a hunter announces when he returns from a successful hunt. He sits in silence until someone asks him how the hunt went. Then he must say that he found nothing of any worth. On the following day, his companions go out with him to collect the kill. They're expected to do so with a minimum of enthusiasm, complaining loudly about the distance and wretchedness of the game. Instead of being offended, the hunter agrees and apologizes for his lack of skill. So they're not boasting, right? And so they don't boast because they don't want to start a cultural norm that the hunters are somehow superior. And so please read page 15 in depth about this interpersonal box. But there's questions to think about. And the first one says, the exclamation point, Kung is the name of the culture, are encouraged to speak more modestly about their accomplishments than we are. Why do you think that culture encourages us to take credit for our success? We're not answering that one, but the things you might think about. The second is, although we are less modest than the Kyung, there are times when our society instructs us to be modest. When do you feel it's appropriate to be modest, and when do you feel it's appropriate to take pride in your accomplishments? And then we're going to have a combination between that one and the following, which is Can you think of other ways we communicate that say something about our cultural values? So I'm going to ask you to complete 2 tomorrow on top of the video I alluded to in yesterday's video, which is going to ask you to think of cultural terms that constrain us, as well as another question that ties into attempts for us to be modest, or ways that we communicate that say something about our culture. We do particular things, and that displays that our culture values this belief. All right, that concludes Chapter 1. Chapter 1 has been instructed and provided for you on Tuesday, May the 14th. So you have through Thursday, May the 16th, to ask any particular questions or follow up with anything in the textbook, the slides, or this video that you find a little bit confusing, or that you'd like to make comment. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.